let's talk about crime. Why does it happen? Is it really just about a few bad apples making bad choices? Or could it be something deeper? What if the very system we live in is actually set up in a way that creates crime? That's the huge provocative idea we're digging into today, looking at crime through the lens of Marxist theory.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the core idea of a society split into two classes. Then we're going to ask a really bold question. Does capitalism itself cause crime? From there, we'll investigate who's actually writing the laws and whether justice is applied equally to everyone. And finally, we'll look at the massive crimes that might just be hiding in plain sight.
All right, first up, a tale of two classes. See, before we can even get to the crime part, we have to understand how Marxist theory sees society itself. And at its heart, it sees a fundamental conflict. And that conflict all plays out inside a system we live and breathe every day: capitalism. From this viewpoint, the system has one main goal, and that's profit. Real power in this theory isn't just about politics. It comes from owning the things that make money. The businesses, the factories, the banks. Now, this system creates two major groups or classes. On one side, you have what the theory calls the bourgeoisie. Think of them as the ruling class. They're the ones who own all that stuff, the businesses, the property, and they make their profit from other people's work. And on the other side, that's the proletariat, or the working class. That's most people who sell their time and their labor to survive. And according to this theory, that relationship isn't just business. It's the central conflict that shapes everything else in society. So, if society is built on this basic conflict between owners and workers, what in the world does that have to do with crime? Well, that brings us to a pretty controversial question. What if capitalism itself is the problem? To explain this idea, Marxist theory uses one single powerful word: criminogenic. Criminogenic. It's a heck of an idea, right? It means the system isn't just reacting to crime that pops up. No, this theory argues that the very nature of the system creates the perfect conditions for crime to grow and even thrive. To put it another way, crime isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. So how does that work? Well, the theory points to four key things. First, poverty. When people are desperate, crime can start to look like the only way to get by. Then there's self-interest. The system encourages a dog-eat-dog mentality where you've got to look out for number one. Add consumerism to that mix. We're constantly being shown ads for stuff many of us can't possibly afford, which can obviously lead to theft. And finally, you get frustration. Seeing that massive inequality all around you can create anger and resentment that sometimes boils over into violence. Okay, so if the system creates the motivation to commit crime, what about the actual laws that tell us what a crime is? This leads us to our next question. Who is actually writing the rules? Just let that sink in for a second. This isn't just some random statistic. It sets up a really powerful point about what our legal system chooses to prioritize. And here's where that fact really hits home. It is illegal for a person with no home to take shelter in an empty building. But at the same time, it is perfectly legal for a wealthy person to own several houses and just leave them empty. Marxist theory would say this is no accident. It's proof that the law values private property more than a person's basic need for shelter. So why would the law be structured like that? Well, this quote really gets to the heart of the explanation. It argues the state, which is seen as working for the ruling class, doesn't want to pass or enforce laws that could hurt profits. Things like tough anti-pollution laws or strict rules to keep workers safe. The top priority in this view is protecting the income stream for the wealthy. So, if the laws themselves are written with a bias, what about how they're actually enforced on the ground? Well, this takes us to the idea that there might be a double standard when it comes to justice. Take a look at this number. Over a 15-year period in the UK, this is how many people died because of their employer's negligence. Over 2,000 people. Now, out of those more than 2,000 deaths, how many companies do you think were actually prosecuted for corporate manslaughter? Just 25. In fact, it turns out that on average, only about 1.5% of companies that break major safety laws ever face prosecution. The numbers here paint a pretty stark picture of what the theory calls selective enforcement. And this has a huge impact. Think about it. When crimes like theft and vandalism are policed heavily, but corporate crimes that cause widespread harm are mostly ignored, what happens? It creates the impression that crime is really just a working-class problem. The theory argues this is intentional. It distracts all of us from the harm being done by the powerful, and it can even pit working people against each other instead of them questioning the system itself. And that brings us to the final piece of this puzzle, the kind of crime that gets the least amount of attention, the crime that is, in many ways, hiding in plain sight, corporate crime. I mean, a perfect example is the Volkswagen emissions scandal. The company literally programmed 11 million cars to cheat on emissions tests. The result? These cars were spewing toxic fumes up to 40 times the legal limit. And this isn't some victimless crime. This kind of pollution has real-world consequences for public health and the environment.
So why don't we hear more about these huge crimes? Well, there are a few reasons. The people doing it use incredibly sophisticated ways to hide what they're doing. The crimes themselves are often buried in layers of complex business deals. Because of that, public awareness is usually pretty low. And on top of all that, big companies spend a fortune on their public image to make sure nobody would ever suspect them of causing so much harm.
And this brings us right back to where we started. This quote really sums up the whole perspective. Crime isn't some weird thing that happens when society breaks down. Instead, it's seen as a natural, predictable result of a system built on inequality and exploitation. So we're left with a pretty challenging final thought. Is crime just an unfortunate bug in the system, something we can fix with a few tweaks? Or, as this theory suggests, is it a fundamental feature of the way our society is built? What do you think?